The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the sprawling estate of the Whitmore family. The manor, relic of old money and tradition, stood proudly amidst acres of manicured gardens and ancient oak trees. Inside, Eleanor Whitmore sat by the window of her study, her fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty glass of red wine. At 52, she was the picture of elegance, her silver-streaked hair swept into a loose chignon, her emerald-green silk robe clinging to her still-youthful figure. But behind her composed exterior, Eleanor was a woman adrift. Her husband, Charles Whitmore, was a man of routine and restraint. A successful businessman, he spent more time in his office or on golf courses than at home. Their marriage, once passionate, had settled into a comfortable but distant companionship. Eleanor had long since accepted the quiet loneliness of her life, finding solace in her garden and the occasional glass of wine. But all that changed when her stepson, Daniel, returned home. Daniel, Charles's son from a previous marriage, was 28, a striking young man with his father's sharp jawline and his mother's piercing blue eyes. He had been away for years, traveling the world and pursuing a career as a photographer. When he arrived at the estate, it was supposed to be a brief visit, a chance to reconnect with his father and stepmother before heading off to his next assignment. But something about Daniel's presence stirred something deep within Eleanor, something she had thought long buried. At first, their interactions were innocent enough. Daniel would join her in the garden, helping her prune the roses or plant new blooms. They would talk for hours about art, travel, life. Eleanor found herself drawn to his easy charm and the way he looked at her, as if she were the most fascinating woman in the world. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, and it intoxicated her. One evening, as the sun set and the garden was bathed in twilight, Eleanor and Daniel found themselves alone on the stone terrace. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. They had been laughing over a shared memory when suddenly, Daniel reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was electric, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice trembling with something she couldn't quite place. "I've missed you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eleanor's heart raced as she searched his eyes, finding in them a reflection of her own longing. She knew she should pull away, should laugh it off and retreat to the safety of her role as his stepmother. But she couldn't. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her breath catching as his fingers traced the line of her jaw. That night, they crossed a line they could never uncross. In the weeks that followed, their secret affair became a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises. They met in the garden under the cover of darkness, their passion as wild and untamed as the roses that surrounded them. Eleanor felt alive in a way she hadn't in decades, and Daniel worshipped her with a fervor that left her breathless. But with every touch, every kiss, the weight of their betrayal grew heavier. One night, as they lay tangled in the sheets of the guest house where Daniel was staying, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and dread. "What are we doing, Daniel?" she whispered. That's wrong. We both know it." Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious. "Is it wrong if it feels this right?" he countered, his voice low and urgent. "Eleanor, I've never felt this way about anyone. Not ever." She wanted to believe him, to lose herself in the fantasy they had created. But the guilt was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Charles, oblivious to the storm brewing under his own roof, continued his routine, leaving Eleanor and Daniel to their dangerous game. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. One afternoon, Charles returned home early from a business trip, his unexpected arrival sending Eleanor into a panic. She had been in the garden with Daniel, their laughter echoing through the trees. When she heard the front door slam, she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Daniel, go," she hissed, pushing him toward the guest house.
"Now."
Daniel hesitated, his eyes filled with concern. "Eleanor, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "If he finds out—" Reluctantly, Daniel slipped away, disappearing into the shadows just as Charles appeared on the terrace. His sharp eyes scanned the garden, lingering on the spot where Daniel had been standing moments before. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze piercing. Eleanor forced a smile, her hands trembling as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "No one," she lied. "Just talking to myself. You know how I am with the roses." Charles studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He said finally, before turning and walking back into the house. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. That had been too close. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Charles, ever the astute businessman, began to notice the subtle changes in Eleanor's behavior. The way she jumped at the slightest sound, the way she avoided his gaze. He also noticed the way Daniel's eyes lingered on her, the way he seemed to hang on her every word. Suspicion gnawed at him, and he began to watch them more closely. One evening, as the three of them sat down to dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. Charles cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Daniel," he said, his tone deceptively calm, "how long do you plan on staying with us?" Daniel glanced at Eleanor before answering. "I'm not sure," he said carefully. "I've been thinking about heading to Europe for my next project, but I haven't decided yet." Charles nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly.
"I see."
"And Eleanor," he continued, turning to his wife, "you've been spending quite a lot of time with Daniel, haven't you?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. I suppose so," she stammered. "We've been working on the garden together. It's been nice." Charles's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nice," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How very domestic." The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed beside Charles, she could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on her. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The breaking point came a few days later. Charles had been going through the household accounts when he noticed a discrepancy, a charge for a hotel room in the city, dated a week earlier. He confronted Eleanor, his voice cold and measured. "Care to explain this?" he asked, holding up the credit card statement. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had forgotten about the hotel room, a reckless indulgence she and Daniel had shared. I can explain," she began, but the words caught in her throat. Charles's eyes bore into hers, his expression hardening. "Is there something going on between you and Daniel?" he demanded, his voice rising. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the weight of her guilt was too much to bear. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed everything, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles listened in stunned silence, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. The fallout was swift and brutal. Charles demanded that Daniel leave the estate immediately, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. "Daniel, torn between his love for Eleanor and his respect for his father. Left without a word, his departure leaving a void in Eleanor's heart that she feared would never heal. In the days that followed, the once vibrant estate became a prison for Eleanor. Charles, unable to forgive her betrayal, withdrew completely, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions alone. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt like a graveyard of memories she couldn't escape. As the seasons changed, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the choices that had led her to this moment. She had sought passion and connection, but in doing so, she had destroyed the fragile balance of her life. The affair with Daniel had been a fleeting escape from her loneliness, but it had come at a cost she could never have imagined. In the end, Eleanor was left with nothing but the echoes of what might have been and the painful realization that some secrets are better left buried.